everybody. Heartfelt thanks to David Christian and his team for having me. I apologize that I wasn't able to be here yesterday for the first day of the conference, which I think is one of the very important conferences of these years to go to. So I cut my presence at the COP21 climate meeting in Paris short, so I arrived late last night. Obviously, it's not really worth staying on till the end of this, what came known in inner circles as CREP 2021, right to the end. Simply, we don't have to expect very much of what comes out of Paris. Is no news. Nobody had high expectations. One thing that will come out of it, of course, a agreement, however you will call it, perhaps the Paris Accord, commitments of states, of course, to do a lot better and still sticking with a 2-degree target and so forth. The reality is, and not unexpected, states are not capable in their current configuration and their incredible dependence on the dynamics of economics, to be blunt, economic neoliberalism, incapable to really develop the kind of strategies that we need for the Anthropocene. One of the good things in Paris was a number of so-called side events where we focused on some of the key themes of the Anthropocene. The very name of the Anthropocene was featuring prominently in a number of events. But when it comes to the key challenges or what's required in our new age, there were events around rights of nature, events around the role of ethics in policy and law, and events around the Earth Charter. One of the greatest things that I've done in my professional life that I'm very proud of is being associated with the many, many thousands that helped crafting the Earth Charter. We started in 1992 and finally adopted it in 2000, and thereby making the claim, I think the credible claim, it's the first international document ever that was entirely crafted by us, by civil societies all around the world, or by emerging global civil society. States had no say in it, but states seem to be increasingly being challenged, to say the least, by the fundamentals of the Earth Charter. So I urge you, right from the start, since I'm not going to talk about the Earth Charter at all, to please take note of the Earth Charter. Read it, disseminate it, because it, to me, provides really the framework for our thinking in the Anthropocene. What is required? The key theme of the Earth Charter is actually ecological integrity. So that's what my talk is going to be about. Arguably, the antithesis to collapse that we are seeing in various parts, not just in ecological systems, coming from Europe, you're seeing collapse even of Western societies. I spent quite a bit of time in Greece giving talks about the incredible austerity measures that the European Union, under the leadership of Germany in particular, being German, I might be able to say so, forcing upon Greece an idea of economics which has been proven to be utterly wrong. But of course, it's a kind of paradigm that we're in. We're almost forced into these ever-increasing austerity measures, and there are a couple of other problems in Europe that you know of that all have to do with the scenario of collapse. And I'm talking a little bit about this. The antithesis, arguably, is sustainability. And Phil Steffen, this morning in his talk, referred to this, right? At the end of the talk, if you recall, he put this kind of dichotomy to us. What is our option, collapse or sustainability? In a good traditional fashion, I will not, being a lawyer, right, I will not talk to slides, but rather give a talk as I have it in my script here, loosely based on my script, and using the slides as a background. So you just bear with me. We lawyers have a tendency to look at definitions quite a lot and refer to statutes and trying to focus to some text. So what I'm covering briefly, collapse and sustainability, what are the issues there, in order to then define the concept of ecological integrity and what it may mean for our structuring of better laws and better governments. Now, cycles of of collapse and recovery are really a constant in the history of Earth and our life on Earth. In pre-human times, we had these phenomena of, say, rapid volcanic eruptions, or asteroids impacts, or rapid climate changes. So it's nothing new per se that we are, in our history, have experiences the dynamics of collapse, but each of those collapsing systems was followed by some form of recovery. Mind you, in very different configuration, and certainly not in a straightforward manner, depending on the circumstances. But nevertheless, collapse and recovery have created a remarkable resilience of life on Earth. Thanks to the Goldilocks zone that we are in, it's not too hot and not cold and just right. Life has continued to flourish. So observation number one, these kind of dynamics of collapse and recovery in some configuration is not new, and it has certainly not changed through the advent of the human species or Homo sapiens. The only change that we have been experiencing in recent times is when we talk about collapse now, we are talking, I guess, about the collapse of civilization as we know it. And I won't go in any details further illustrating the various aspects of collapse in ecological systems. But one thing is for certain, that any kind of dynamics of collapse that are likely to occur if business as usual continues will bring great changes to the way we live. It will probably be a life without the benefits of human rights, without the benefits of democratic societies, without the notions of good life, who knows. But a number of things that we have become accustomed to are at stake here, and they might be gone. Let's look at some of the anthropological literature. For example, Jared Diamond, who stands for many here in this field, but he pointed certainly out that there are usually 5 interconnected causes of collapse that may reinforce each other. Non-sustainable exploitation of natural resources, climate changes, naturally occurring climate changes, diminishing support from friendly societies, hostile neighbors, inappropriate attitudes of change. When you think about what he described for, societies rising and declining is certainly valid for today. In our Western civilization, we can certainly detect all these 5 elements. And what the key of this all is, not just according to Diamond, but to other leading historians of society, collapse like Arnold Toynbee or Joseph Tainter and others, what's essentially at stake is the ability of society to develop new ways of thinking and put them into place. So basically observing what is required in order to solve a situation that is bound for collapse. And we in the Western world should be aware of our specific role here. While we could point to the fact that it's part of the Western civilization that we have things like philosophy, being able to reason in the abstract of any concrete experience, but foreshadowing alternatives, and of course fundamentally reflecting on wisdom. We have reason, rationality, freedom, democracy, and so on. But what we also have is nationalism, colonialism, capitalism, economic growth, to name just a few of the key features, all European inventions. Geographically, but of course metaphorically. United States, of course Europe in that context. I referred to this phenomenon of what is the dark side of European thinking as the European cosmology. And I think any kind of looking for alternatives would have to bear in mind the various features that we are seeing as part of our heritage in the way how we think about ourselves and the natural environment. One is dualism, won't elaborate on it. It's obvious what's meant by this. Anthropocentrism, right, we have talked about in various contexts. 3, materialism, which has to do perhaps with the Cartesian worldview that has dominated us for the last 300-400 years. Atomism, a phenomenon in science in particular, being focused on the bits and pieces rather than being able to see systemic concepts and thinking laterally and so forth. Greed, as a sort of exploration of what I call, what I see as the direct result of an excessive understanding of individualism, the core idea of liberalism, just liberalism going berserk, so to speak. And finally, economism, that we have a tendency to measure everything that matters for us privately, and more importantly, perhaps in public life, through the lenses of economics. And when you look at this, the first letters of these 6, easy to remember. But the good thing about damage is it's not completely defunct, right? It just has a dent. Something's not quite right. So the antithesis to this phenomenon of really a reductionist, anthropocentric idea of the world that we are part of would have to do with obviously holistic thinking, organic worldviews, and so forth, but also when it comes to the area of doing better in the way how we organize societies through law and better governance, the antithesis would have to be sustainability. This is how I suggest you should read it. It's the ability to sustain. Sustainability is the phenomenon that some of us, and hopefully most of us, experience. What do you do in times of crisis? What do you do when you're not quite sure what to do? You rely on your resources, and you rely on what's most precious to us, what is steady. Things like love, health, meaningful relationships, but also, of course, resilience, self-organization, and robustness. The term itself gives us further clues. The word sustainability, sustinere, Latin, historically comes from the German word Nachhaltigkeit. And that found its way into French language and eventually into English. But historically, we're celebrating 300 years of this concept, economic concept of sustainability or Nachhaltigkeit, thanks to some good writings of a certain person, Karl von Karlowitz, one of the key figures in the area of the early Enlightenment, defining the source of any good economy, the sustainability of nature or natural resources. Now, this concept of Nachhaltigkeit has been explored recently by Ulrich Grober, a historian from Germany, called Sustainability, A Cultural History. I really recommend this book to you, because what it does do, it gives you the counterculture in Europe. The fact that there was always a lot more than just the various things that I alerted to earlier. There was a much more holistic approach to the way how societies organize themselves. The word Nachhaltigkeit found its expression in the German dictionary from 1806, when it was defined as something that you hold on to when everything else does not hold anymore. So this, I think, in German anyway, is a very good definition. Something that you hold on to when everything else does not hold anymore. So really, Nachhaltigkeit or sustainability is what sustains you when everything else is falling apart. This brings us very close to the only acceptable definition of what sustainability actually means. Just as much as you cannot be half pregnant, you're either pregnant or you're not. You're either sustainable or you're not. And this is the only way to explain it, so I don't even want to qualify it as strong sustainability, which means, of course, that we need to base all social and human system on the single biggest system that we know, the environment or the ecological or planetary ecological system. So a hierarchical model. So in other words, ecology first, society second, and economy third. The planetary boundary modeling is, of course, a strong hint to the validity of this. If it's true that we need to somehow organize ourselves now and in the future within more or less objective boundaries, physical boundaries that we have to respect, then logically it would mean that our thinking has to start there and not, how can the economy continue the way it does, and then, by the way, how can we do a little bit better protecting the environment. So this is important. The clue is, of course, also that planetary boundaries work is a hint to a new ethics, to an ecocentric ethics rather than anthropocentric, and a very strong proof of the fact that we need to shift fundamentally in our social and economic terms to sustainability based on this model here. Now, let's look a little bit closer what sustainability then means in law, what it means in science. I have to qualify, not science per se, not law per se. If it would be that easy, it would be great. But the very idea that ecological systems would have to have a certain integrity in order to function properly, in order to respond to changes. So a healthy ecosystem, think of yourself as a person, think of any system, in fact, and not necessarily even ecological systems, needs to have the ability to maintain your identity and at the same time respond to changes. And the better we can do it, the healthier we are, and vice versa. So integrity is really a key aspect here. And the good news about this is that the notion of ecological integrity is a legal concept. Mind you, a hidden one. And that's really the story to be told, the big gap between what good lawmaking was initially sort of guided by and how it has been immediately interpreted by governments and by corporations. Is a gap. But it is very important, I think, to insist that any good achievements in the area of environmental protection, environmental law and so forth, they wouldn't have come about if it were not for you people, for us, meaning people who care, activists, who promote ideas, and then, of course, eventually politicians and others pick it up. Now, this is just an example. There are 23 multinational environmental agreements, global agreements, that have a direct reference to the objective to protect the integrity of planetary systems. I'm just only picking a few examples. This is the preamble and then Principle 7 of the famous 1992 Declaration on Environment and Development, which calls for, in the preamble, I quote, working towards international agreements which respect the interests of all and protect the integrity of the global environmental and developmental systems. Then Principle 7 of the Rio Declaration reads, states shall cooperate in a spirit of global partnership to conserve, protect, and restore the health and integrity of the Earth system, ecosystem. This very phrase is repeated in many other documents, such as Agenda 21, the 2002 Johannesburg Declaration of the World Summit of Sustainable Development, and even in the otherwise very flawed outcome document of the more recent 2012 summit, Rio Plus 20, that you might still have in your recent memory. In the Future We Want document, as it's called, there's specific reference to adopt methodologies and ways of thinking that lead us to holistic and integrated approaches to sustainable development to guide humanity for restoring the health and integrity of Earth's ecosystem. Another example is the famous Brundtland Report that many of you will have heard of. This started the whole international debate about sustainable development, right? The United Nations Commission on Environment and Development. Even the Brundtland Report, not known for being rather ambitious, but arguably very ambitious in its contents and goals and objectives, largely misunderstood The sort of common definition that we have about sustainable development is, of course, the one where we just accept that future generations should not be worse off than us, right? And everybody cannot. But what has been overlooked, that the Brundtland report quite specifically refers to the integrity of natural systems as the foundation of any social and economic development. And you don't find this in the literature about sustainable development. It's easy to say that's, all in the percentage reduction, but the point to be made here is that the fathers and mothers of these ideas, they were insisting on the fundamentality of the integrity of natural systems. Jim McNeill, to mention one of a few people here in this context, he was the Secretary General of the Brundtland Commission and the lead author of the report. And he's now in his sort of late 70s, and now he's writing a few articles about what really happened, the mismatch between what was actually intended back then and what governments and business picked from the context. You find here my reference to Gore Norm. This is an argument that I will not bother you with. This is the question in law and jurisprudence. How do you qualify a fundamental concern that is not necessarily expressed in any laws? Think of human rights, for example. Human rights are more or less taken for granted in a sense that all governments and decision makers would have to acknowledge and respect the universality of human rights. They are the kind of benchmark of all policies. Whether they may be in practice or not is a different issue, but they are really seen in the field of jurisprudence as fundamental, a benchmark for all our policy developments. So in other words, you must not develop policies that might threaten or undermine human rights in this sense. So in a similar way, we could think of the integrity of ecological systems being a Grund Norm of this, or benchmark of this nature. A few names, Jim McNeill, I mentioned, and I mentioned a few others because my very own field, environmental law, which is a field with some 370 scholars around the world, is unfortunately, in a similar way to economists, I guess, not at the forefront of ecological thinking, right? Just think of economics. Most stuff you learn at universities is traditional neoliberal economics, cost benefit, and so forth. And it takes the new branch of ecological economics, and of course a number of us are, of this group are among us. So similarly, you have to envisage that in law you have a growing body of ecological theorists and ecological lawyers. Now, I mentioned here Staffan Westerlund, who was one of the pioneers of environmental law in Europe from the Uppsala University, who passed away a few years ago. But he, in his latest text, said, overlooking 40 years of environmental law scholarship as being taught at universities, has not achieved anything of any substance. And we cannot even blame others, right? Economists or power structures. We should also blame ourselves as a legal profession. There's a lack of appreciation, so Staffan Westerlund, of the fact that the subject of our research interest is ecology, ecological sustainability. This should be the raison d'être, the reference point, or ecological integrity, against which we measure, right, the validity and the usefulness of our laws. And another person worth mentioning, Douglas Fisher, emeritus environmental lawyer from Queensland University of Technology. He wrote a very interesting book recently called Legal Reasoning in Environmental Law. He looked at court decisions in some 16, 17 different jurisdictions, in international law, including International Court of Justice and so on, to figure out how the environment features in those court decisions. Turns out that judges by and large take the viewpoint that you and I would take. We are more or less informed about environmental things, right? But this is totally outweighed by an economic paradigm that seems to be sitting deeply in the thinking how judges reach their decisions. So he is concluding, Douglas Fisher, in this very meticulous study, that we need to do two things. One, we need to have better laws that are actually focused on the core objective of protecting the integrity of ecological systems and making them an overarching objective. And second, you could say we need to teach judges, or we need to teach ourselves. It's also an implication of these findings that it's not just the idea, it's not just what you write into statutes and laws that matter. Most important is how we reflect on them, right, and what we think. New Zealand, by the way, where I'm coming from, has the most advanced environmental law in the world, arguably, so many people say, since 1992, because it's sustainability as its core objective. Nevertheless, New Zealand doesn't feature any better than any other country, largely according to research that we have conducted over the years, largely to the fact that judges are following the mainstream paradigm. They just think that you can't challenge the fundamental idea of growth is good. So we're talking growth versus ecological integrity here. Interesting findings from the field of environmental law. And finally, Sanford Gaines, a colleague from University of Arizona, very recently wrote an article about environmental law in the 21st century, where he says that we have completely failed as a legal profession. By inclusion, by the way, it's not just environmental lawyers, all lawyers, right? The people who teach this stuff at law schools and who practice it, overlooking the fundamentality of planetary boundaries, the fundamentality of ecological sustainability as a core reference point. So what I will do now, very briefly, in the interest of time, we have you know, with permission of Mr. Chair there, I might have to use not the 30 minutes, but I cut it a little bit shorter, maybe, you know, just finishing off in 5 minutes, so we are back on track. The dimension that I want to alert to now, after having established, hopefully, more or less the argument that ecological integrity ought to be a fundamental norm in law and governance, and we have some evidence that this is actually the case in a number of international agreements, but of course also in domestic law, and I will not further deal with it. The idea now could be, and I'm very cautious here, to translate the idea, ecological integrity also to social systems, including financial and economic systems. Some initial reflections on a project that we are conducting in collaboration with colleagues from the Planetary Boundary Movement, our project called Planetary Integrity Project. Starting with the observation here, Immanuel Wallerstein, Yale University, a sociologist. The biophysical Earth systems and historical social world systems ultimately form a single, inseparable whole whose mode of operation needs to be elucidated. So obviously he makes the point that ultimately these systems are intertwined, they can't be really separated. Maybe there are, of course, significant differences. For example, natural systems arguably have no purpose. They're just doing what they're supposed to be doing, whereas social systems and human-made systems usually pursue a certain purpose, right? So there are significant differences, but by and large, a system can only function if it maintains its integrity. And what we are trying to pursue in our project, which will end, by the way, with a report to the United Nations Secretary General, that we hopefully get some input into the United Nations discourse, calling for major reforms. First, in the United Nations level, there's, of course, ongoing debate about, you know, increasing global governance effectiveness and redefining the role of states and so on. But a significant first step might be that the United Nations might initiate some thinking around those ideas as well. What I'd like to finish off with is the kind of template or methodology that we are pursuing. So what we have in mind, there's a group of currently sort of 15 researchers, is that we are focusing on integrity as a central category for the Anthropocene, for policy and law and governance. But we're also saying that integrity can guide us in detecting a working financial system, locally, nationally, and globally, a working economic system, and so on. So the whole range of public policies should be captured in that way, and we would like to distinguish between 4 stages in our analysis. One, describing the status quo as we see it, what's perhaps good and what's not so good. Second, what might be the collapse scenario look like? You know, what is it like actually when the next financial crisis turns out to be a massive one, which is almost certain, right? That the 2008-2009 crisis is just around the corner. The next one, it will be more massive and will not be easy to overcome again. So let's think about the possibilities of either immediate or long-term collapse of the financial system as it's currently being treated as being of no alternative. And then a sort of another stage, pre-collapse. What can we do, knowing that things get worse as if we continue with business as usual? How can we perhaps prepare for a soft landing, or how can we perceive or preempt potential outcomes and incorporate it in our thinking today? And then a post-collapse scenario. What happens? What happens when climate change has fully kicked in? Arguably, it has already fully kicked in, but the full impacts were yet to be felt. Coming from the South Pacific, I know what I'm talking about. We have a lot of climate refugees coming to Auckland. Many of my students are literally climate refugees, right? Literally, they make their cases. They have no place to go. Come from Tuvalu and other low-lying countries. Of course, New Zealand government does not recognize climate refugee, and no country does. They don't want to open the Pandora's box. But these are realities, right? So climate refugees are realities. In Europe, we have environmental refugees, economic refugees, and refugees from not just immediate war situation in Syria and so on. This phenomenon in itself, it's worth exploring further, not to install fear, but to get a realistic picture of the time that we are in. I will skip this. We're very brief, just as one of many scenarios that we are going, just to give you a feel when it comes, for example, to the integrity of ecological systems. Status quo, definitely ecosystems at risk. We have talked about it, and I won't elaborate any further. Collapse would be a situation where we see more of the already 3 planetary boundaries that we have overstepped, right? What about the other 6? And it's only a matter of taste or interpretation or a gradual assessment that we can almost define ecological collapse as the degree by which we are overstepping planetary boundaries. Climate change is only one example that we are facing. Pre-collapse, obviously, transforming law and governance. And I would summarize in this way: we will be much better off if our thinking is organized around basically 2 ideas. One would be perhaps ecological integrity as a sort of fundamental principle expressed in many documents and laws. And secondly, it needs to penetrate institutions. It needs to inform the decision-making bodies of institutions. If you have the time, have a quick look outside. There's a latest book of mine called Earth Governance. What that does, it looks at the new role of states that we should embrace. States should be seeing themselves as trustees. Trustees not just of their own citizens, but also of citizens of other nations, so-called foreigners. There's a deep trusteeship relationship between governments and citizens, at least if you employ state theory. That's the point. In state theory, certainly in continental European countries, it's well established that states have a trusteeship responsibility towards us. In our 21st century, in the Anthropocene, trusteeship modeling needs to include the global environment. So the book is basically about the trusteeship for global commons, what it means for the United Nations and how states can redefine themselves in order to embrace this new role. Now, these are just arguments, of course, but nevertheless, perhaps arguments worth pursuing. And the post-collapse scenario, I won't even go there, at least not in this forum. I don't want to end on a sort of negative note here, but rather let's draw some conclusions. What I've tried to do is sketching some of the dynamics of collapse and sustainability, how they panned out in history and how they may shape the future. Then focused on eco-integrity as a fundamental concern for any society aspiring for sustainability. We have seen how ecological integrity has in fact already informed contemporary international domestic environmental law. This could lead us to conclude that preservation of ecological integrity constitutes, at least potentially, a fundamental norm or Grundnorm that ought to guide law and governance. We can liken such a Grundnorm to similar basic concepts, such as the rule of law, freedom, justice, and equality that modern Western civilization prides itself of. Perceived in this way, our current global civilization is not doomed to collapse, provided it takes the preservation and restoration of Earth's ecological systems seriously. This will be, no doubt, the key challenge in the Anthropocene. Given the fundamentality of eco-integrity for survival and prosperity, human-made systems need to be designed accordingly. At present, they are not. It may be a matter of debate whether or not current developments within the global financial and commercial system are disastrous and life-threatening to humanity. Some would say we are just experiencing yet another crisis, thinking, for example, of current situation in Europe, which of course characterized by these three things: austerity, refugees, and terrorism. But there are systemic roots for all of these. This is the kind of thinking that's required. It's quite obviously, we can always say capitalism, but it's a little bit too easy. So obviously, there are dynamics that we need to fully understand before we then can develop the alternative. Certainly from an ecological perspective, economies are doomed to fail as long as they rely on growth. There's no infinite growth in a finite world. The alternative is ecological economics, in terms of economics. And of course, as often, terms give us the clue, right? Oikologos is the logos, the idea, the spirit of the house that you and I want to live in. And when we have such an idea, then the experts come in, called economists, who measure these things in order to make it happen. The nomos is the measuring of a house that we envisage. And this sort of gives us the idea of what comes first here and what comes second. In the Anthropocene, we need to develop a deep sense of responsibility for the earth. This is best expressed in the ethics of stewardship and guardianship, calling for a new attitude in governance. Institutions such as nation-states need to understand themselves as trustees. Trustees not just for the well-being of their citizens, but also for the well-being of citizens of other countries, and for Earth herself. Fundamentally, obviously, it is a question of whether we are able to learn, meaning first having some vision of the kind of future that we all want to be part of, and being able to express this, first of all, in ethical terms. And in many ways, I suggest the ethics of stewardship and guardianship summarizes somewhat the kind of attitude that many of us, of course, feel instinctively. Indigenous people more so than the rest of us. Living in New Zealand, this is one of the reasons why I went to New Zealand, living close to tangata whenua. If there's anything that I've learned over the last 25 years, how incredibly rich we are as humans if we listen to the voice of indigenous peoples. So the challenge that for us as Westerners is, of course, to translate and understand the language that is part of our own ancestry, right? And realize that our so-called Western civilization has a lot to learn, but not in the sense that we sort of draw back. I mean, we can't go back to past times, but rather the contrary. When we think of the future here in the Anthropocene, it's a truly globalized world. The best thing about a truly globalized world is it's a non-Western world, because the Western is only part of a much bigger experience of many generations to come. So thank you very much.